Sob Bekhair. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Kimia. I am leading the Rising Stars of Iranian American Women Foundations. This is the second seminar and panel that I'm hosting, and it is the 15th series of the online conversations and the panels that AIWF has had since the beginning of the pandemic, since we've kind of shifted away from having face-to-face meetings. I'm also a senior artificial intelligence consultant with Wells Fargo, but this is obviously not related to that. The discussion of today is about harassment with a focus on sexual harassment. We'll talk about the background information, the definitions, the variations of harassment. We arrive at sexual harassment. We talk about the legal implications of it, social implications of it, experience of trauma. We talk about boundaries. We talk about consent. We talk about how our culture as a society plays a part into the dilemma that is going on. And we talk about the responsibility of organizations, our social responsibility as citizens, as well as talking about the healing process. What does the healing process look like? And how can we contribute to that healing process? To start, I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. Azizeh, we'll start with you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, Kimia Jan. Thank you to your organization for having this opportunity to talk about harassment and healing. My name is Azizeh Rezaiyan. I'm a therapist. My focus is on couples, working with couples. I've been doing this work for almost 27 years now. My training, in addition to standard training that we all get, it's additional 5 years working and being trained to work with couples, from parenting young children to premarital, to infidelity, sexuality, communication, you name it, everything that is about relationship. My training was done in 3-4 different countries: Germany, Switzerland, America, SLN Institute, and therefore my work is very much culturally based, somatically based, meaning integrating body and psyche together, and is interactive. And I'm located in Palo Alto. I have a question. When we admit people, is it going to click the whole time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Azizeh.
Okay.
Awesome.
That's about it.
Thank you, Azizeh. Mahsa, your turn. I'll appreciate if you can introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. I look forward to this very important discussion. My name is Mahsa Hakimi. I'm the founder of Hakimi Law, a boutique law firm in the city of San Francisco. I've been practicing for over 20 years now, and just for my professional background, I currently serve as an advisor to the city of San Francisco on the Equity Council for the city. One of the 11 advisors. I also serve as I serve on the board of the Castro Cultural District, and I also serve on the UCSF Alliance Health Project board as advisor to them too. My background, I've been while I specialize in corporate and art law, I've been very much an activist in LGBT and women's rights issues for the last 25 plus years. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today. So I know this is a long discussion. We want to make sure that we have enough time to, discuss all the important points. So without further ado, Azizeh, I'll start with you. I'd like you to talk to us about harassment. We'd like to start with a holistic view of, what entails as harassment when we talk about harassment, what happens in the background.
Sure. Well, this is a very in-depth question, and please stop me if I'm going too far with it. Harassment has a wide range of definitions. In its nature is offensive, and it's hostile, and it is unwelcomed behavior, is demeaning, it's humiliating. I can't really talk about harassment and separating harassment from the definition of bullying. I know Mahsa Jan is going to talk about harassment from the legal view, but I'm going to be talking about the psychological view. Harassment, in a way, is sexual bullying. And bullying is something that people do it to feel better, to feel superior, to feel belong to a community. And it's a learned behavior. It's a learned behavior that actually we learn from very early on as from a small society community that is called family to the larger society of school, medias. Unfortunately, it's done just use some sort of power over someone else. And it comes in different form. It comes in verbal, physical, emotional, now cyber, social media. It is a learned behavior in a way that when kids actually watching their parents, watching the father, if I want to use a little bit more stereotypical definition of it, but it is not just father to mother, mostly is male to female, but it happens the other way around too, that it's a fight and argument that is based on hierarchy. And the child is watching it. This hierarchy could be father to mother. It could be older child to the younger child. It could be male to female. It could be children against each other. And these kids, all of us, when we experience and observe such behavior, we grow up to be a bully. And then later on, this bully that it's happening at school, elementary, middle school, from more social, it gradually transforms to even sexual, whether it's a look to, demeaning look to someone, or to go to the extreme of it, of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and rape. So this is what I can define as harassment for now, and then I'll talk more about it. Go more in depth.
Thank you, Azizeh. Mahsa, I'd like to turn the question to you. I'd like you to talk to us about your understanding as a lawyer as well as a social activist when it comes to harassment and sexual harassment in specific. What are some legal implications that we need to define? What are the terms and terminologies that we have to really be clear about? And I'll be sharing the screen as you'll be speaking.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for IAWF for having this panel, because I do want to start off by recognizing that you're one of the only organizations that's actively and intentionally engaged in this continued discussion and conversation about sexual harassment, which is a very important issue within our own community after the Metoo movement stories that exploded in our community this spring. So I just wanted to kind of thank you for that, because this is important that we continue having these conversations outside of the newsworthy stories that we hear. And to give the audience a little bit of background about who I am and why I'm here today, because you're wondering why a corporate art lawyer will be sitting here and talking about these issues. So when I tuned in to listen to the discussions on social media this spring about the Metoo movement that started from Iran and expanded onto the US soil, I realized very quickly that there's a very clear disconnect between the actual legal process in the US versus our community's understanding of what sexual harassment means and what it entails. Most notable was that the definitions and terms and standards of proof that were interchangeably used by people within the community on social media was not only mistaken, but it was actually incorrect in some way. So it dawned on me that if we as a community don't understand or misapply the basic concepts of a very legally defined, what we call illegal activities, how can we address such important social issues within our community? More importantly, how can we change the discourse of such an important issue if we don't understand what we're dealing with? So that's how I got involved in this, and I've engaged in these conversations about legal definition, the legal process, and also the society's responsibilities that are not answered to the legal system. So I put this chart up that I've made in the last couple of months, just to kind of, I've learned that people are more visual, so I want to share this with you. So I'm going to start to talk about two distinguishable legal issues. One is sexual assault and one is sexual harassment. I think one of the, and it's not just in our community, this is generally in any community, there's always this misassociation or interchangeable mistake of using these very, very specific legal terms when something comes up and the conversations start about these issues. So I broke it down. So when we talk about sexual harassment, it's a pretty wide and large category of actions. What I decided to do is I'm not going to talk about sexual assault, sexual abuse, which is for minors. And I'm just going to specifically talk about assault and harassment within the adults and people who can consent legally. So first and foremost, what I realize people don't understand is that sexual harassment is not necessarily a criminal action. So when we, in the legal system in the US, there's very distinguishable systems. One is a criminal system and one is a civil system. They have a very different standard of proof, and they're actually treated very differently, and the requirements for actions that are brought under criminal law versus civil are distinctly different. So for sexual assault, that is a crime. First of all, let me start by what they both have in common. They both are illegal. So whether it's sexual harassment or sexual assault, they are both illegal actions. They are unwanted and uninvited. They are harmful to the victim, physically, emotionally, or mentally. And very important, because this is something that keeps coming up in these conversations, these laws are gender neutral. So when we talk about victims, the general assumption is that we're talking women because they are the majority of the victims. But I just want to be very clear that the law is actually very neutral. So it's applicable on both ends. So when we talk about sexual assault is a crime. It's considered criminal, which means if there is a sexual assault claim, it generally is a criminal case. So the requirements of sexual assault is that it has to be intentional. So the person who's inflicting the abuse or the assault intentionally meant to do that. And on top of that has to be physical. There has to be a physical contact. So it's not, if there's no physical contact, it is not a sexual assault. And it has to be no consent. And this is a little bit of a tricky part, because when we say consent, it means the victim either expressly or not expressly has to consent. And that means the victim either does not consent or cannot consent. This is where we get into the whole idea of people being intoxicated or not being aware. So you cannot have a sexual encounter with somebody who is not aware that this is happening. So on a sexual harassment, that's a civil case. It's not a criminal act. And the way it's defined is it's not the intention of the person who's doing it. It's actually unwelcome behavior by the victim. So it's how the victim receives it. So this is very important distinction. It's all about the person who's receiving, how they're feeling. It can be physical, but it also can be verbal. And the thing about sexual harassment, it is actually, it's limited to interactions in workplace or education institutions. And so there has to be a relationship in which there's basically somebody has a power over somebody else. And it is defined under the Constitution of the United States as part of a discrimination claims under Title IX. So sexual harassment is treated as a discrimination. So that's why it's a Title IX claim. And that's why it's associated with workplace. So when we look at this chart, most people follow it. We all kind of agree, and conceptually it just seems very straightforward. What's the problem? However, it really is not. If we move to the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you so much. So there is the legal theory and then there's a legal process. And if anybody has ever gone through a lawsuit in this country, I do this all the time. I tell my clients, it's complicated. It is never straightforward because you have to prove a case, and proving a case, all kinds of stuff can come out and all kinds of surprises that can take a different direction as you go through the process. So what makes this even more complicated, because these are about actions of people's feelings and how they're receiving it. So for a sexual assault case, as I mentioned, it's a criminal case. So what happens is, because a criminal claim, it is state by state, and worse to that is actually county by county. So where that assault happened defines how this process is going to go forward. There's no umbrella rules around this. Generally, it's a criminal case, as I mentioned, and it starts with a police report. So basically, when there's an assault, you will have to show up to the police, after the trauma has been inflicted on you, in that space that you are. You have to be in a mindset to be able to go in and do a police report, which means you have to live the trauma very quickly if you do that. And what happens is, basically, there's a police person who is going to take the report. And that person who writes that report has the ability and the power to make a difference of whether or not this case is going to be picked up, because they, at that moment, will decide if that report is worth making. So they might write a report, but depending on how they write it or how detailed they are and so forth, how they deal with it, it might not even go anywhere from there. If that report is worthy, the DA's office, usually the district attorney's office, the local attorney's office, will decide if they're going to pick up the case. So you don't get to choose your attorney in a criminal case. The state or the town or the county will actually assign you an attorney. So these kind of cases are complicated, and the district attorney offices, generally by virtue of their existence, are very political. So it's very important that they win the cases. Losing cases is not good for the career of a district attorney, just the virtue of the reality of how it is set up. So the district attorney's office will take cases if they're winnable. And that pretty much eliminates cases that do not have good evidence. And you can imagine, in a sexual assault, there's not always good evidence. So, and the reason for that is because the standard is beyond reasonable doubt, which is the highest, the most difficult standard of proof. And because sexual assault is basically about one person's consent or not, this becomes almost impossible to prove whether or not somebody consented or not, because nobody was in the room, unless you have physical evidence in which they've been beaten up, or there has been an exam and there have been physical, physical hurt that can be actually documented. It's almost impossible to agree on whether or not it was consent or not. So on top of that, and then, of course, if they pick it up, it goes to trial. And so in every phase of this victim will have to keep relieving this trauma. And it is emotionally and mentally really difficult and challenging. And people just break down. They don't make it. When it comes to sexual harassment, on the other hand, that is a federal non-discrimination claim, as we mentioned. And those claims are civil cases, they're not criminal. So basically, if you are harassed, let's say by your boss or your colleague, and you told them that you don't like it and they continue, the general understanding is that you can hire a lawyer of your choice, because the employment claim, usually there's a statutory damage, and attorneys usually will take these cases easier in some way because they can get paid. The other thing is, under the Title IX, the employer can be also liable for these sort of behavior. So generally, when you have a larger employment or institution, there's a better chance of getting these cases forward. And usually it ends up in settlement or some kind of compensation. Rarely they go to trial unless it's a systematic issue. But usually they are somewhat easier. But when we say that, it has to be the caveat that when we say easier, it's still complicated. And it's like people don't want to lose their jobs. People, you file one of these claims, you might not get hired by somebody else ever again because you get tainted. So these are the kind of stuff that sometimes people just don't move forward. So it's not as easy also, but for different reasons. So to give a reality check on how complicated and difficult this is, especially with sexual assault. If we can see the next slide, please. I wanted to give everybody sort of idea. So the victim who gets assaulted or harassed, it is very common. I put few things in color up there for you to see. Sexual assault or harassment is always, always, always the element of being unexpected or unwanted. Nobody wants to be harassed or assaulted. So for that reason, there's always that experience of trauma for the victim. So underlying every case of assault and harassment, there is trauma. So when people have trauma, it's really subjective. So basically it means that while I might be empowered and take on, who knows, maybe, maybe not, somebody else might go into denial, somebody else might go into avoidance, people can go into shame, which is the most common, they can get confused, people get angry, they try to minimize the experience because it's too much for them to handle it. So, I hear this a lot, people just say, well, they should have just filed or gone and filed also, go to the police or talk about it, or why didn't they talk about it? That initial response should never be the measure used for truthfulness of the story that's being told. Trauma is very subjective. So for that very reason, in California, the system understands that people don't always come forward right away because it might take a while for them to digest it or recognize or accept or acknowledge it. So California has a 10-year limit of statute of limitations for sexual assault cases. Now, that said, for sexual harassment, there's only a 1-year statute because it's a Title IX claim. And there are occasions in which if you cannot file a criminal case, you can also file a civil case for sexual assault. And those tend to be a 2-year statute of limitation. So what the point of this, I want to kind of give you visually understand that sometimes people's initial reaction should not be our decision about how we're going to believe him or not. Anyhow, if we can go to, I want to give you some statistics about the actual reality of what happens in the legal world when it comes to sexual assault cases. Can we see? Yes. So this is from RAIN, which is the national recognized organization that deals with sexual assaults in the United States. A lot of times people just ask me, why don't they just report it? Why they should have, they proven innocent, innocent until proven guilty. The reality is that as of today, the world we live in right now, out of 1,000 sexual assaults, and I'm talking about assault, I'm not talking about harassment, I'm talking about cases in which people have been violated physically, including rape, including assault, attempted rape, all of these violent crimes. Only 310 people actually report, go to the police and file report out of 1,000. Out of that 310, only 50 of those will lead to an actual arrest. 28 will actually lead to a felony conviction. And out of that, 25 will be actually jailed because there's always some kind of a sometimes, a lot of times actually the DA makes some kind of a deal with the person who committed the crime. So the reason I'm showing this to you is because I want, and on top of that, you add a community like our community in diaspora, those numbers dramatically drop because the immigrant communities really do not report these things. So that's my, that's the, yeah, thank you, if I can take it out. So that's the, a quick, 5-10 minutes in the legal process of how all this works.
Thank you, Master June. That was very comprehensive. Thank you so much. Azizeh, the next question would be for you, and I think you're muted. Just making sure that you unmute yourself. Mahsa talked about the experience of trauma, and I do agree that we can't really talk about trauma. We can't talk about harassment and the experience of sexual harassment without kind of focusing on trauma and you know, shedding some light on trauma. Can you talk to us about trauma?
Azizeh, you are muted.
Yeah.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yeah, much better now.
Right. So when we talk about harassment from our psychological point of view, we cannot just limit harassment to sexual harassment. We have harassment, which again, slash bullying, can come in forms of gender, age, gender reassignment, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and disability. When someone experiences this kind of humiliation, it actually shatters or impacts that sense of self within the person. When it's sexual, it's even worse. When it's non-sexual, it is more seen, acknowledged. It's easier to go out there and talk about it and being heard. But when it's sexual, it is difficult because it really goes to the core, khishtan. It goes to this sense of who I am, and brings itself with itself all sort of past and background experiences that we have from our childhood in the society, in the family, in the culture, in the religion. It brings a sense of maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I'm bad. Maybe it was my fault. If my skirt was a little bit longer, if I had not gone out a little bit too late. And it brings sense of shame, guilt, judgment. In some cultures, such as our own, more or even less than some other societies, it brings a sense that if I speak about it, what's going to happen to Oberu, to saving face for my father, for my family, for my community? How are they going to look at me at work? How are they going to treat me later? Especially if, as Mahsa John said, if this experience is going to the law and nothing comes out of it. I have had victims of rape that they were severely injured, but nothing happened when they went to the law and took the case to the court. Nothing happens. And as Mahsa John said, the victim goes through the memories, has to explain and experience everything all over. So when we talk about sexual trauma, we are talking about something that is really put us, turns the self into pieces. It's most of the time when we talk about sexual traumas, the victim in more severe cases, whether it's sexual or not, let's say from war, torture, natural disasters, car accidents, any sort of accidents. What happens in those severe cases, the victim separates itself, or in a way leaves the body. And most of the time, their experience is they watch themselves, that something is happening to them, but they're watching, not really experiencing inside. They become the observer of the assault, of the trauma. Now, when we talk about trauma, I cannot just talk about sexual abuse or sexual trauma. I have to talk about all sorts of traumas, from a very subtle one that happens between mother and child. When a mother is holding her baby, breastfeeding, and looking at the child, but she's not in tune, meaning she's not in tune with the child, meaning that their brain waves are not linked together. That child, 2 days old, 2 weeks old, 2 months, 2 years old, feels a sense of fear that no one is available to take care of me. And if this creator of mine is not available to take care of me, I will die. That is a trauma to the infant, to the toddler, to the young child. But the same continues throughout life. So if we want to have a more simplified definition of trauma, trauma is that overwhelming experience that is outside of our daily functioning, daily experiences. And we cannot really hold on to it without splitting, without leaving the body in order to survive. Now, when it comes to healing, I have to say the best mentors of mine, Peter Levine, who died years ago, and Van der Kolk, they both are pioneers of trauma that they focus on the body and spirit and attachment, early on attachment. They both believe that trauma is reversible. We can heal from trauma, but in order for trauma to be healed, we need to have correct, accurate, healthy treatment, which brings that shattered, that fragmented spirit back to the body, meaning that the treatment has to involve the body, and that's a very more in-depth, complicated conversation for me to have right now. But people who actually, if we go back to traditional, more tribal ways of healing treatment, like shamans or some Latin Americans, they really get the community together and heal that victim through community, through chanting, through body work, to bring that person back to present time and make the person, the victim, feel solid, grounded. And when that healing is back to the person and the person becomes present, it means she knows, he knows where that person is and doing in the moment. What has happened in the past is in the past, what I'm doing in the moment, and where I'm going to go from here after.
Azizeh, sorry to interrupt you. I would like to ask you about healing towards the end of the discussion. So I'd like us to keep maybe some of those ideas towards the end. But you mentioned something really important. You talked about the experience of trauma. You actually brought up the earliest trauma that a child can experience, which is feeling out of tune with the mother. And when I think about sexual harassment, I feel like, there are so many added layers to that, because it's no longer about you and your experience with a loved one. All of a sudden, there's a cultural aspect that is added to that. There's a social weight that is added to that. It's no longer about you. It's about you and your family. It's about your future. It's about your reputation, your family's reputation. So I'd like to ask the next question from Mahsa, and being a social activist, Mahsa, and thinking about the issue of sexual harassment through different lenses, what's your take on basically the irony that is happening here, and what's contributing to this to this turmoil of harassment, and what's the experience of people, specifically women, when they go through these these stages and this trauma? and what contributes?
Thank you. That's a very good. So I'm moving on to the so you know, when this all was happening and friends or people reaching out talking to me, but there was interesting questions that were repeated. Like it was a common question people asked me. They kept saying, "This is America. Why don't they just sue?" They kept telling me, if this really happened, why people waited that long to come forward. They would tell me, in America, you're innocent until proven guilty. So if they go to trial, they should be able to prove it. And then the most common one that I got was that women can just lie and ruin somebody else's reputation. And it will always follow with, oh, I have a friend or a cousin, somebody who their ex-girlfriend just accused them of rape and ruined their life. And then I would get, you know, a very honest thing from some of the men saying to me, I'm just scared to date now. So it really made me think about this whole issue of why these are very legitimate questions. So that's part of the reason why I've decided to talk about the legal issues, because part of sexual harassment is, yes, there's a legal system, but the legal system is failing. It's not in this context, it's not working because the application is not considering the trauma of the victim. It's just going through the traditional understanding of innocent to proven guilty. So when the legal system is not working, then we have to come back to society and how do we address these issues, because the legal system is not there to be a solution actually to this social dilemma. And in fact, what is interesting is what people don't realize is the laws are actually not absolute. The laws were written by certain people in certain contexts, and these laws keep evolving and changing. At least in this country, it does, right? This is the beauty of this legal system, is that I just want to give some people some, so as we change as a society and we get educated, we become aware of things, the laws actually change to reflect the change of the society. For example, gay marriage. Until 1989, sodomy was illegal in most of the states in the United States. As of 2014, gay marriage became legal. Women could not vote till 1920. These are laws, by the way. So the system was set up to do certain things based on the society's needs. And when things change, laws change. For example, statutory rape did not include heterosexual sex with minor boys. And we just changed that very recently. So it's not that these laws are only for the girls or the women. We actually are looking at it from a more pragmatic issue of as a human being. Because every time there's a victim, we all suffer. When somebody in your family or a friend gets hurt and that trauma comes out, it affects us individually. So as a society, when I started with the Metoo movement. I started with the LGBTQ movement in the 1990s, and I moved to the Metoo movement, and I was part of the conversation dialogues and learning and listening. And when I came to the Iranian community, then what happened this last year, it really dawned on me that we have a cultural conflict. And when I say that to you, I don't mean it I appreciate our culture very much, but in this conversation, we have a disconnect. And the reason is because I just went through the legal definitions of things, right? So when it comes down to it, it's all about consent, and it's all about setting boundaries. These two are important elements of how to eliminate or minimize sexual harassment or sexual assault cases, right? And then we are in a culture that is ingrained in us. Part of our pride actually is this concept. Three pillars of our culture are ta'aruf, غیرت و آبرو. So these very three concepts, by virtue of their definition and how it's practiced, is in contrast. It's kind of like a challenge to how do we deal with sexual harassment. Let's just talk about America, where the system is in contrast to the very notion that we've been raised as Iranians. So this is where it gets tricky, right? Because it's not that easy. We have been told from the beginning, I can tell you from experience, right? Look, I use this example, and it can be used in the wrong way, but I'm going to use it over here. A classic example is our wedding ceremony, beautiful ceremony. We have this amazing ceremony. And yet when it comes to asking the groom, are you going to take this woman as a wife? He immediately says yes, because that's what we expect. We expect our men to be very assertive and clear about what they want. When it comes to our women, we ask the bride, are you going to take this man for your husband? عروس رفته آب بیاره. عروس رفته گل بچینه. 3 times they have to go some imaginary place just to give this thing a notion that they're humble and they're from a good family and they are worthy, and you have to wait for that. Beautiful ceremony, by the way. But what does it tell subliminally to us? It's telling our women that you cannot really say and jump and say, I want to marry this guy right away, because she's dying to marry him. That's why she's there, right? But she can't say that. And it's teaching our guys that when women say no, or they express, or they're saying something, don't take it at face value. You have to do it 3 times. So, well, in a context of a sexual harassment, by the 3rd time, that's just crazy. So this is our dilemma right now, right? This is something, and I think this is where I think us as a community have the obligation to have these conversations and continue learning, educating, understanding. While we can cherish a value of our culture, there's certain things that it should not be applicable to, and we should be very clear about that. So, when you say society, people always ask me, how do we do? Society is not some abstract thing out there. It's us in our homes. It's us at our workplaces. It's us in our community, in our parties. And anyhow, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you certainly did. Thank you. So what I understand is that we can't really consider the legal system to be the final solution, because we have this notion among a lot of the diaspora that, you're living in America, just sue them. Like, you can't do this or you can't do that. This is absolutely not like, they won't allow you. They'll put you in jail if someone does that. So I want to make sure that I understand correctly that the process of, documenting harassment and then getting it approved and then having someone to defend it like an attorney. It's a very complicated process, and it is in itself, I think, a very traumatic experience, because you have to keep repeating what has happened to you to people and to police officers that may not necessarily really feel for what you've been through. Is that your experience?
Yeah, my experience, my personal experience in the last 20 years that I've been involved in many of these sort of situations is it is really emotionally complicated. And what happens with the law is not supposed to have emotion. It's supposed to be fair and just. So it's supposed to not have any emotion. And this is actually a very emotional experience. So it's not just for us Iranians. The system of the legal system we currently have for sexual harassment and sexual assault is miserably failing. Hence the Metoo movement. And the movement objective is not just, apart from educating, it's also to change the social consciousness in a way that we can address these in a way that can actually deliver results. Because when Azizeh was just mentioning, majority of women who are actually the victims who actually get even physically, they get raped, and they come and file, and the district attorney decides that their case is not viable because they're not believable. And this is the biggest issue. We always put the pressure on whether or not the victim is believable. How do you deal with that when people are so complex and respond to a trauma so differently? So this concept that we put on the victim, that they have to be believable, is fundamentally flawed and wrong, and we should never be doing that. But we can't really get there till we keep talking and learning.
Yeah. Absolutely. Azizeh, next question is for you. I'd like to get into the concept of boundaries. I know Mahsa touched about boundaries and consent, and Mahsa, I'll probably come back to you for consent again. But when we talk about boundaries, something that I always kind of ponder upon myself is that our culture, specifically for women, both women and men really, but specifically for women, it's very hard to set boundaries. It's not because we don't know what we want. It's just that when we do set boundaries, it's not always enforced, and it's not always, taken into account or respected. So we have, boundaries speaking about boundaries is one thing, and then reinforcing those boundaries, and then feeling confident enough and shameless enough, I should say, from a cultural aspect to keep going back to the original ask, and not kind of looking too rude or too poor-ru or too too unfeminine, as a lot of people talk about it. So I'd like to know what's your take, what's your definition of boundaries, and what's your understanding of the dilemma that is happening in the Iranian diaspora, specifically those living outside Iran, when it comes to defining boundaries, setting boundaries, and enforcing and reinforcing it.
Before I go to talk about boundaries, I like to add to what Mahsa John said in terms of society and responsibility of different organizations and each one of us. We need to not only empower our daughters, our mothers, our own self, our sisters, the community of women. We need to educate our men, our sons, our brothers, our fathers, our male colleagues. Without educating them, we are alone, and the system continues protecting the laws that was written for certain people. So we need to bring them along with education, with empowering our own self to change the laws, to go and educate politicians. Now, going to boundaries, I think the best definition that I have learned about boundaries comes actually from an Iranian American young woman. You can follow her on Instagram, The Nurtured Life. I think the resources are there. You can share, Kimia John. That, boundaries exist from day one in our natures, out there in the nature, in the universe, within our bodies. The best way to define boundary is to know that just like the organs that we have in our body, different organs are working together in harmony without being intrusive to each other, enmeshing or distancing, withdrawing, abandoning each other. Then the whole body works. Now, how do we really get in touch with that core essence and innate ability of knowing about boundary? Again, goes back from psychological view, because if we don't have that foundation, we can't go to adulthood and society. As I was saying, the mother can look at the child and the child turns her face around, meaning, leave me alone, I had enough of this contact. And when the mother is absent and doesn't realize that, that child gradually learns to not know what boundary is about. It misses the ability, it does not learn the ability to know, as definition of boundary, where I begin, where I end, where you begin, where I end. When we have a healthy boundary, Kimia John, can you take the screen, the sharing off now, if you don't mind? So I can see faces. When we have that healthy upbringing and aware of our own natural boundaries, we own our lives. We are in charge of who we are. So when I say no to you, my no is no. When I give you consent or don't, it is really through me. It's, I don't say no, but my body language is scared that if I say no to you, I'm going to lose my job. You're not going to love me anymore. You're going to abandon me. I'm going to be judged later on. So these are the definition of boundary that, to me, is the most important learning that we need to provide to our children, our community. And Oh, when we talk about healthy boundary, Kimia Jan, we were talking before, I brought the concept of agency. Yep. Agency is self-agency, meaning that when I have that healthy upbringing, then I have self-agency, knowing, as I said, that's the concept that it's good to know, that I know I can take care of myself, no matter where and how. I want to give you an example. Let's say there are 4 or 5 people in a car accident. They all come out, or 3 of them, let's say, come out. One collapses emotionally. The other freaks out. The third person comes out and starts helping the injured ones. So each one of us experience trauma in a different way and deal with it with different way. It is not just dealing with the trauma, it's feeling the trauma, okay? When I feel my trauma and I work through it, then I become present. Then I know I said no, I said yes, and I mean it. I'm not afraid on what you're going to do to me later. Now, one thing I want to say about empowering women, educating women, and educating our men. When we just educate our own selves as women, and then we go back to our homes, we go back to our relationships, and we don't have our partners as educated, we are going to be more victimized, we are going to be feeling more lonely and distant, and do not know how to deal with our sons, our male partners, and everyone else to feel bonded, connected, and not alone, which is one very important in terms of, a very important experience in terms of healing trauma, to not feeling alone, that I'm not alone in this process.
So what it seems, Azizeh, is that boundaries are, it's both basically a concept of nurture and nature. So we are being born as kids, with boundaries. We know very well, at least physically, what's comfortable, what's not comfortable, what we like and what we don't like. And then growing up and being raised through a culture that teaches you that you need to think about your abaru, you need to not to be rude, not to be too outspoken and all that. We kind of lose that power and that ability to talk about what we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with. Mahsa, a question for you when it comes to consent. Is there anything else that you want to talk about, maybe from a legal perspective, when it comes to consent? How can we prove that we've given consent or we've not given consent?
So prove is interesting. Thank you for asking that question. So one of the things that as I said, that I hear a lot is that men's feeling of discomfort about what they can or cannot do. So here's the truth. Here's the reality. When it comes to sexual harassment, is defined as unwelcome or unwanted behavior. So it's about what you're giving to the other person, the feeling that you're giving to the person, right? Average people, all of us, unless we really are avoiding the situation, we know exactly when we do something and the person does not like it. It's either through their look or they don't have to say it to you. We know. And I've known people, I'm sure everybody knows, that even when you tell them that was not funny, they continue doing it. So that's where it becomes a problem. Average people, when they know something is not welcome, they won't do it. So in the sexual harassment case, you shouldn't be scared to ask somebody out. You shouldn't be scared to try to make it, you want to make it pass. But if you get the sense that that person is not comfortable or doesn't want it, back off. That will save you. That's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. For women, and this is a part of we women have the burden of doing, is we cannot continue being passive. If you're uncomfortable, don't be afraid to say it or express it. If this is something you don't want, you don't have to do it. So there shouldn't be this, so we have to teach our girls to learn what boundary is, and we have to teach our boys how to understand what that means. And it falls back on our parents and ourselves, but also on us as adults. When you talk about consent, consent is clear. I want it or I don't want it. If you're not sure, if you're in the circumstances, even in the middle of, very exciting moment in your romantic night, if you are not sure that that person, first of all, they're intoxicated, do not do it. Even if they had a couple of glasses and if they're not themselves, just don't go there. And if you feel at any point, so it comes back to that person who's actually doing it, you have the intention to sleep with somebody, just be responsible to make sure that you are clear about them wanting to do it with you. So we can do all the legal things. How do you define consent other than that? Like it really comes down to that moment. We need to step up and be mature and adults about it, rather than just trying to say, oh, I didn't know, because most of the time we know.
Yeah, and maybe as part of the education that you talked about to both girls and boys, should be included the fact that your feelings and your wants and needs can change from night to night. You might feel very comfortable with one person, in the beginning of the night, and then feel that, oh, that's not what I thought. I don't feel comfortable. So what I was okay with earlier on, I'm not okay with anymore, and that can change. And it's completely okay to feel that way, and it's completely okay to verbalize that. And it's actually very important to assert that, and to not to give up until you're being treated exactly as you'd like to. I'd like to talk about our responsibilities, and just want to also make a side note on the side. I have received a few questions for everyone that's on the line. If you have any questions, we're getting towards the end of the discussion, so feel free to put your questions in. We're going to be talking about the healing process and our responsibilities. Azizeh, I wanted to maybe start asking the question from you. When it comes to our responsibility as a society, what do you think is important? Because I feel like, speaking about trauma and the fact that you mentioned that healing really has to happen in the context, because it has happened in the context of the relationship, it has to be healed in a relationship as well. So I'd like to know, what's our responsibility as a society? How can we listen? I don't have a feeling that we are good listeners to trauma victims. And I don't feel like as a society we're prepared to welcome this and to basically receive these, the trauma and listening. So what's the process of listening?
Well, I would say when someone with trauma, whether severe or very subtle and light, comes to us, we need to listen empathically, meaning that I should be able to put myself where the other is and feel their experiences. Doesn't mean I necessarily agree with every detail, but it means I listen without judgment, without accusation, without questioning their reality and their experience. The victim, the person who's speaking, needs to be seen and heard and understood. That's my very basic responsibility. As I said previously, if we want to talk about community, we need to educate our lawmakers, our teachers, our coaches, our parents, the couples, to create that sense of support, that you are not there alone. You are in this system being supported. And that's really what I can think of.
Yeah.
When we deal with trauma in that way, trauma becomes not a life sentence, but it becomes, in a way, an experience that transfers you to someone more aware, stronger, and the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, transforms to post-traumatic stress disorder. It awakens your body, your emotions. The symptoms, the toxic symptoms of trauma will be transformed to a supportive allies in your life. And it leads you to be happier and more confident person. It is all about that confidence and self-esteem and how I can assert myself. And that's all the learning that it happens from birth to the day you're gone, continuously.
Awesome. Mamnoon, Azizeh. Master Jun, same question for you. What's our responsibility at an organizational and institutions level and as a society? And I'm not sure if we have you on the call.
I'm muted. I'm muted. Very important question. You know, there in any evolution of a society, we have to first identify what the problem is and have the, understand the complexities of it, and then have the conversation, and then the healing. How do we heal, which is a whole different conversation. But as a society, especially, so my focus these days is the Iranian diaspora in US. I don't talk about anybody because I don't know any other experience. So I'm going to focus on us in this country. We have the privilege of living over here, and with that comes a responsibility also. And the responsibility is we have to continue educating ourselves. We have to continue. This is an important issue. The Metoo movement is real and it happened for a reason. It's not that because women just wanted to make noise. It's because continuously this has been a traumatic experience in society that affects, as I said, all of us. We all should care because it affects us individually, it affects us as a collective. When you have these sort of traumas come up, it really does change what happens around us and our society. The issue is there's a legal, right? And we talked about how complicated it is. When you get to social, it's even more complicated because we all bring our own personal experiences, our expectations and understandings and our feelings into this very, very emotionally charged conversation. So first and foremost, we have to divide two responsibilities. One is us as individuals in the community. And then one is our institutions and our organizations in our community. And what I mean by that, there's that personal responsibility. And I talked about a little bit, it's like we have the responsibility to teach our girls every occasion that we have, to empower them and teach them that they need to understand that they have the right to set the boundary and be clear and own it. And we have to teach our boys that they need to listen and understand when somebody says, what does that mean? Listen and be engaged in that, and vice versa. But the more important thing is we as a community, as people, we need to keep sharing. We need to talk about these things. The healing does not start until we start talking and recognizing and hearing each other. So please keep sharing, please keep talking, keep listening, and keep learning. Because rather than fighting each other, and when I say this to you, I'm actually inviting our men to engage in this conversation more than our women. We know how it feels. We need to engage our men. Things do not change. This will not change until we as a collective understand what needs to happen and what the experiences are. So today I'm looking, I think I have 30 something. I have few men on this panel. I want to thank them personally for being here. And I really want to encourage our men to feel safe to come and have and converse, and because we need to hear your side of the story as much as we need you to hear our side of the story. So that's an ongoing thing that we have to do, each of us, over to our brothers, our husbands, our fathers, our sons, our colleagues. So please keep talking. Don't make it it should be a conversation. Then I get into the responsibility of our organizations and our media. I have to tell you, I am baffled, and this is I have a criticism, and I am going to be and I'm just going to go public right now. After what happened this summer or this fall, or I'm sorry, this spring, it is unacceptable that only this panel is the first one that is even engaging in this conversation. All of our educational institutions that come out and lecture us about culture and lecture us about responsibility and try to teach us about how great our culture is, you have the responsibility to continue these conversations. It doesn't have to be adversarial. It can be an educational conversation. So these panels should be through our universities. Every Iranian study program, every cultural program out there should be lining up to invite experts of psychology, legal experts, people, victims, to have conversations. So the silence is baffling to me. The second thing is our media. The media has the responsibility to continue these conversations. They cannot just be sensationalized and do events and stories that are just exciting and sell the story. This is an ongoing problem in our community that needs to be discussed. So I put it aside from us as individuals, then we should take a responsibility to push on these organizations and the media to keep hounding that we need to have these conversations because they have access to more population than we do. Until we don't talk, we're not going to heal. We can't even start a healing process. So that's something I want to share. But I also wanted to, one thing I wanted to also be clear, when we talk about this issue and the sexual assault and sexual harassment, I want to be clear again, this is a very neutral, gender neutral issue. I don't want us to have this sensation that men are not victim or they have not been. That is absolutely incorrect. And it's important for us to also recognize that men are victim too. However, the reason we focus on the woman is the reality of the world we live in, that majority of the women are the victims. Whether it's because of the position of power that still is held by men, or the society and so, majority, or the physics, whatever you want, majority of the victims are women. And so we cannot have this conversation and make it an equal conversation yet, till we address the majority. And that's sort of the same concept as the Black Lives Matter. It doesn't mean that when we talk about Black Lives Matter, other lives don't matter. It just means that the Black population has had a disadvantage in society that they need to be addressed first before we give equal footing to everybody. So I just want to make sure that when we talk about this, it's not that we're not talking about men being part. That's when we talk about these things, it's actually gender neutral. And I look forward to the day that we don't have to talk about these things anymore.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mahsa.
Also, just a second.
Of course, please go on.
Quickly, I want to add to what Mahsa said, and I'm thankful that you brought it up, that men are victims. And when men are victims, they're not just victims of sexual abuse. The abusers come back and in the community treat them, I apologize, saying like you're a sissy, and give them a lot of other labels verbally, explicitly in the community. And those men have no place to go and talk about it because it brings more shame up, you're not a man. When it comes to trauma and communities' responsibility, please be there. And when the victim comes to you over and over and over, talks about it, don't get tired of listening, because part of the healing process is the sharing the story over and over. And I hear my own self over and over. And every time that I hear my own self, I give a different meaning to the experience. And I put that shadow self more together to become coherent. So please be there and listen. Another thing I want to add here about Metoo movements. Please do not leave those victims alone. Bring more of others into that conversation, because in many cultures, including our own and some others more than our Iranians, when the victim of abuse, harassment, bullying goes and talk about it in terms of Me Too, that woman, even man, is going to be disowned by the family, by the community, and they need you more than ever.
Very true. I think you answered the question that I wanted to ask you about, the healing process, as you touched on a little bit earlier, and the fact that, reviewing and revising the experience and talking about it over and over is certainly part of the healing. And the fact that we hear from a lot of people that, oh my God, you're just overdoing it. Why do you keep repeating yourself?
Get over
it.
Get over it. Abuse in general is the most, especially I'm talking about sexual abuse or harassment, is the most denied, avoided, untreated cause of human suffering.
Yeah.
And those who have suffered inflict suffering to others without knowing. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it's very important that we go and listen to them. Unfortunately, even in the field of psychology, up to a few years ago, they wanted to treat traumas with a pill, which it's not going to work. Trauma means I share and I share and I share as I grow and go through different stages of life and development.
Very true. And I'm going to start incorporating the questions that I've received, because I think it's it's the right time for that, before coming back and asking my final question. But what's your advice? And I'm going to start with Azizeh with you, and then I'll turn to Mahsa. What's your advice to victims who are not believed when they say that they've been victims of sexual harassment, or if they've been they're just not being heard to? What's the right path to take?
Don't give up in searching to find the right people, right friends, right organizations, right communities, right therapists to work with you. Do not make it your fault. Do not make it as if this is something bad, wrong, happened because of you. Don't take it personally. Separate yourself. Tell yourself the bad feelings that I have right now is because of my tradition, my upbringing, whatever has happened. Then it is not my fault. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not bad. I need to go and talk about this. I need to defend myself. One thing I want to say that I don't want to be misunderstood about. When a trauma happens, whether sexual, whether physical, of any kind, especially physical, emotional, and sexual abuse and harassment, when I don't work on it, unfortunately, I'm sad to say, I will transfer it to the next generation, and I will put my child in danger of having the same thing happens to her, because I don't see the red flags, because I don't see the signs, and I put my child in situation, in places with people that I shouldn't. And the same thing will happen to the next generation. It is our self-integrity and self-responsibility to not give up, to not stop, and go find someone and a group organization to get support and go through healing.
Awesome. Thank you, Azizeh. Mahsa, do you have anything to add to that? How would you respond to the question?
So I don't have much to add, as you covered that beautifully. I will actually go around to people who are actually hearing from the victims. I just want to ask, when you hear these things, please don't tell them what to do or how they should do it. You should not be telling them that. You do not need to fix it for them. The only thing we need to do is tell them, how can I be there for you? They just want to be heard and feel safe. You don't have to fix it, you don't have, but just please just be compassionate. And as hard as it is sometimes to listen to these stories, I tell you, it breaks my heart every single time. You just need to tell them that you're there for them and you're hearing them.
Awesome, thank you, and thanks, Azizeh, for stressing on the fact that finding the right community and building the right community is super important. Finding people that maybe starting from finding people that have had the same experience from you, listening to them, sharing with them, and then starting from them, and then growing probably from there is something that I've always thought that works in most of the situations. This might be a little bit more challenging, but I guess it's a responsibility that we all have. as whether we're a man or woman. It's not basically a personal problem. If it's a problem for you, tomorrow it's going to be a problem for it can be a problem for any of us. So absolutely agree with that. I have a question.
One more little thing, Kimia John. Healing is an innate ability that we are born with it. It just needs the right opportunity and right place, right people.
And when we talk about healing, I know we've heard from Azizeh, Mahsa, what's your input when it comes to healing? I know we've spoken about apology as part of as part of something that can help when it comes to healing. I know a lot of the victims don't have that opportunity at all, and they really have to carry the load on their own. But is there anything you want to add in that?
So healing is on its own is a complicated conversation, much needed. I can tell you that from my personal experience during this time and talking to victims and just listening and educating myself, the healing starts when people feel, because when you're violated on that level, when that kind of trauma comes out, there's two things that the victims need. To be heard. That's number one. They want to feel that their story and experience is heard. And the second thing is they want to feel safe. So those two elements are very important. But when you mentioned about apology, there's a whole new learning that I'm doing, and it's called The Power of Apology. And it's amazing how people always, there's no one box fits all when it comes to the individual. The same way that the trauma response is different and subjective. Not every victim needs the person who hurt them to go to jail or be killed. That's not necessarily what they want. Majority of them, just as I said, want to be heard and apologized to. So the power of apology is sometimes much more powerful. And so, but that there's a whole art in apology that is sincere, or is just to kind of get off your chest, or is it real sincere? So that sincere apology is very important, and a lot of times people just make a mistake, and it's just a matter of that. But anyhow, I hope that I answered the question.
I like to add to what Mahsa John said. I just remembered that many years ago, I used to work with juvenile sexual perpetrators, juveniles. The power of apology comes when they really sincerely, as you said, Mahsa John, apologize because they can now feel the pain that they have inflicted to the victim. And that happens when they actually get in touch with that wound within themselves, the thing that happened to them, the trauma, the abuse. Majority, 99.9% of those who abuse sexually or any kind, they have experienced abuse, they have been the victim themselves, and they turn to be the abuser, perpetrator later. So that power of apology is very important, not just for the victim, but also for perpetrators, because that person becomes healthier and healed, or process of healing, which is healing. It's not a thing that stops at some point, and learns what happened to him, her, themselves.
Awesome, thank you. A question, Mahsa, for you. If you can expand on the difference of legal system or the legal concept of, a person is innocent until proven guilty, the social right of victims of sexual assault to speak up and be heard by the society, and, basically them not being silenced in the social arena.
It's a great question. That's actually at the heart of the challenge we have as the lawyers in this world of the legal issues. Is I personally have been trying to figure what is it, how we can change, because it's the system as it is, that concept of innocent to proven guilty, as I said, it does not work in the context of sexual harassment or sexual assault, because we're talking about people's trauma. And by virtue of that, when you set up a system that they have to prove themselves and prove that somebody else is guilty, already puts the pressure on the victim ongoing. So that keeps recreating the trauma over and over and over again. To be honest, I don't have an answer for you right now. And I don't know how to expand beyond that. But that obviously that is under the criminal, for criminal cases, that's a standard for criminal cases, not for civil cases. And that's why a lot of times the victims who can afford a lawyer, who can have the resources, end up suing in civil court. But as of right now, and it's a conversation internally that we're all having, how do we add this? How do we change this? Because we've never had, I mean, the world is just learning about this issue as a legal issue. I'm saying it always existed. I'm just saying in the arena of how to address it in a legal system that is existing, and this is evolving. I don't know how to answer that question yet. Hopefully sometime very soon.
I like, if you have time, Kimia John, I like to add something here, observing my teenage daughter at school and the training that the schools are doing at the moment, not just on bullying, but also on harassment and sexual education and what is the healthy and unhealthy sexual interactions. I think our schools in America are doing great. I don't know if such a thing exists in our own country, but I think it's a very good place to start educating our children at this age, because Generation Z really knows about almost all those that I talk and I interact with through my daughter. They know what is the right touch, what's the wrong touch, what is the right on or not right joking, teasing interaction with their peers.
Okay. Can I add to Azizeh for a second? I think a great point. I do want to, going back to my answer. I think this issue, this is not a legal issue. It's more of a social issue in a sense that we as a society have not yet evolved in a way to know how to deal with this and how to add yet. We're still in the very infant phases. And as I said, the issue is when we evolve as a society, the laws will evolve with that. And I think part of the issue we're having right now, our society hasn't evolved yet enough to address these in a way that we can actually accommodate it with the legal system.
And as we progress in a society, different types of bullying, harassment will come to the surface and forms that we don't yet know about.
Very true. I have two other questions. We'll make sure to stop sharply at 12:30. The first question, I'm not really sure if I'm understanding correctly, but it says fear of loss in many levels and finding the right therapist for building up the power, and when is enough enough? Any recommendation in these cases? Azizeh and Master June, any one of you can read this better than I do?
I go, if you don't mind.
Please go on.
Loss. I don't know what this person means by loss. Is that loss of self in a trauma or loss of the other? Either way, it doesn't matter. Loss comes with grief. Through pandemic, we are experiencing that we have a majority of us have delayed loss and grief that is going to come flooded to all of us after pandemic settles down. So is it loss of the other or loss of self? It needs the process of grief. And grief means I acknowledge, I own my grief. I go through the shock process. I go through the anger process. I go through the blame process. I go through acceptance. And I go through giving a meaning to that experience of loss, whether it's loss of myself or the other, that I give a meaning to it, that this meaning, it's a healthy, happy, grounding meaning that replaces that shattered that shocking experience of loss, whatever it is.
Awesome. Thank you. And the last question is talking about the Me Too movements, saying that a lot of people say that the Me Too movement works for you know, in the context of a non-Iranian culture, but when the same idea and the same approach is modeled to the Iranian culture and Iranian society, it just doesn't work. The only thing that it does is kind of defaming the famous people, whether they're artists or political people or whoever they are. And there's a mismatch, and maybe there has to be a different approach. What are your inputs on it? Either one of you that wants to go first.
So it's interesting because the Me Too, even in the US, it didn't start with the famous people. It was ongoing. It's just famous people bring a different sort of a taste to all of this. They bring out issues that somehow we try to justify or explain, or because of whether we like him or not like him, we start taking positions and divides us in that way. It's irrelevant, I think, whether they're famous. It has to be a continued conversation, whether the person's famous or not. It's just that when they're famous, more people pay attention to it, and the audience gets larger because, you know, it's newsworthy. But fundamentally, it doesn't, you know, from a personal perspective, it doesn't matter if you, as a famous person, have the privilege to be treated differently and receive the privileges of being a famous person in society. That comes with extra step of responsibility. So you don't get to take what's good and not be responsible. So that's maybe why the conversation is a little different, because we hold them on a higher expectation. But the premise of what we're talking about, and I do somewhat agree that it's more complicated, and that's with the Iranian community and our you know, understands of who we are and how we exist as a diaspora. I do agree, and that's what I'm saying, that we do need to deal with that internally and keep talking and evolving and distinguishing how where it stops. And so that comes back to this continued, you know, need that we have to keep talking and sharing and figuring out, for us as a diaspora who have certain cultural background, and then we have these issues that are in contrast. How do we address it and move forward in a human and compassionate way, recognizing the damages that are being caused to our community?
Right. I want to add to what you said, Mahsa John. Any dysfunctional system eventually falls apart. And if we are not ready to replace it with a healthy, functional system, then we replace it with something else. Me Too movement has been there, but now we have given it a name. When we give it a name, we give it a more identity, and we can better define it and better deal and feel it and heal it. Okay, now when it comes to our community, I came back right before pandemic. I was in Iran about a month. I enjoyed so much talking to our young generation, whether male or female, because now they're starting to treat each other more as an equal. You know, the girls, the women, the female can joke openly and assertively, or whatever it's called, the same as the male, young male is doing. And they understand each other, they talk, they joke, they treat and interact equally. And that is happening everywhere. All this abuse is happening because I, the perpetrator, feel I'm more than and you're less than. I am better and you're inferior. I'm superior, you're inferior. So I think change is happening. And I am really proud of young generation in Iran that they are educating themselves in that way together. I think that's it. But I want to thank, it's the end of the session. I want to thank IAWF for creating this opportunity to speak openly about what's important at the moment. And I want to thank Kimia for coordinating this talk, and also Mahsa John, because I think our talk was complimentary and you said something, I reminded me of something else, and it was a great conversation. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. We are at time. I wanted to thank Mahsa June, Azizeh June, both of you for accepting to contribute to the discussion. Many thanks to Mayam Khosravani for hosting us and for having open arms to hold a session on this. IAWF is here for our community to make sure that we use our platform and resources to support any men or women who might need our support. That's a statement that Mayam Jun said. Just wanted to read that out. This session is recorded and will be saved and will be shared on IAWF's website as well as Facebook. Thank you all for attending. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Mahsa Jun.